Hello and welcome to this next discussion of church history. In the last discussion we were looking at the Crusades and the rise of Islam and so forth. And before that we were looking at the various schisms that took place, that have taken place in church history. The first one being with the Oriental Orthodox on the issue of Monophysitism. And then the second one being between the East and the West, and with a kind of a one definite date there being 1054 AD, the division between the Orthodox world and the Western Roman Catholic world. The next major division, of course, is going to be the Protestant Reformation, and we're going to look at that. But there are many different aspects to the Reformation, many things that led up to it. And so we're going to have to look at several of those things as we lead up to this this study of the Reformation. One of the developments that we need to look at is Scholasticism. I'd like to read a quote to you from Kenneth Latourrette's History of Christianity, History of the Church. And he says this: one of the most striking features of Christianity in Western Europe in the 4 centuries from 950 to 1350 was intense intellectual activity. A large proportion of the intelligentsia of Western Christendom directed their attention to the problems presented by the gospel. Theology became a major subject of study, the queen of sciences. Some of the ablest minds that mankind has ever known were stimulated by it to profound thought. Thousands of lesser minds were engaged by it. What the Roman Catholic Church of the 20th century adjudged the standard formulation of theology was by Thomas Aquinas of the 13th century, but it was the culmination of 3 centuries of discussion and debate. And so Scholasticism was that discussion and debate. It led up to the time of Thomas Aquinas. He was like the pinnacle of it. Here's another quote from McGrath, his book on theology, Alistair McGrath. He says, Scholasticism derives its name from the great medieval schools, the Latin word scholae, in which the classic questions of theology and philosophy were debated. It is best understood as a theological movement flourishing in the period from 1200 to 1500, which placed emphasis upon the rational justification of religious belief and the systematic presentation of those beliefs. Scholasticism, thus, does not refer to a specific system of beliefs, but to a particular way of doing and organizing theology. So it's very interesting, actually. A lot of people hate scholastics and scholasticism, but actually it had many very important aspects to it and led to many important developments in the Christian church. One of the main objectives of the scholastics was the relationship between faith and reason. Were the two complementary or were they contradictory? Are they compatible with each other? If they're compatible, which should have the preeminence, faith or reason? Can reason demonstrate what's true in the Christian faith? If it cannot, does what is received by faith complement what is reached by reason? Or again, do the two contradict each other? In addressing these questions, scholastics tended to rely on Greek philosophy that they had learned from Plato and Aristotle. Even though at the beginning most of them couldn't read Greek, they can only read Latin. And they had access to only a few of these philosophers' works. However, as time went by, more of their writings became available, curiously, through predominantly Muslim traders. In other words, through interaction with Muslims. That's how they got the works of Aristotle and other philosophers, and they got them translated into their languages. Then when Constantinople fell to the Muslims in 1453, a whole lot of Greek-speaking scholars fled to the West as well, and they brought a much greater knowledge of Greek and classical philosophy, Greek philosophy, and so forth, as well as scriptural exegesis. Jewish philosophers also, curiously, by the way, worked through their faith using Greek philosophical models. It was this time in this era of history, that's just what went on. These discoveries of Greek philosophy really impacted the world. Both Muslims, Jews, also Christians were impacted. Maimonides is the great Jewish philosopher who was impacted by Aristotle particularly. So this is just a movement, like an intellectual development that took place over quite a few hundred years there. And there are certain key figures which I want to touch on, just mention them to you. One of the greatest was Anselm, who was Archbishop of Canterbury in England. Anselm saw no conflict between faith and reason. He coined a very famous expression, "I believe in order to understand." Now, Augustine had also said something similar centuries before. He said, "Credo ut intelligam." I believe in order to understand. And so Anselm wasn't the originator of this, but he certainly made it prominent, the idea that what the church taught by faith, you have to accept, what the church teaches by faith. But you could explain what the church taught, and you can understand it better, you can defend it better through reason. And so he didn't think it was anti-reason, it was against reason. He maintained that the major tenets of Christian faith, like belief in God, the nature of God, the Trinity, immortality, the incarnation, the death and resurrection of Christ, could actually be reached by reason and were, quote, inescapable accompaniments of a rational view of the universe. This is from La Tourette's History of Christianity book. One of Anselm's greatest works I had to read in seminary, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man. Very interesting little book. And in that book he shows why God could not ignore man's sin. He took a real forensic view. And I mentioned to you that the Greek Orthodox view of salvation is they don't like the forensic way. The Latin way is more forensic. And of course Anselm was from the Western Church, a Latin. And so he used reason and so forth. And he had a forensic view. He showed in that book, Why God Became Man, that God could not ignore man's sin. He had to punish man's sin. It's a criminal way of looking at it. Sin is like a crime. It has to be punished. If you don't punish sin, you'll disrupt the moral order of the universe, because God pronounced that this is sin, this is wrong, you're not to do it. He can't just, smile at it or shine it on and just say, well, you sinned, but I guess, there's nothing I can do about it. He has to punish it. And yet, at the same time, God loves man. And so, he doesn't want to destroy man. He said the wages of sin is death, but he doesn't want to kill man. He doesn't want to destroy man. He loves man. So what he has to do is he has to devise a way that he can get man out of his dilemma, a way to save man, a way that satisfies both God's divine nature and moral order, and yet also provides a way for man to be saved, right? And so the way that God solved the problem, according to Anselm, was that he had to become man himself. And then he could live in such a way as to satisfy his own requirements. And you see, the interesting thing for Anselm, sin is man's problem. Man sinned, right? So a man has got to pay for sin. Man's got to be punished for sin because it's man's problem. So God can't really pay for man's sin because the law says man has to die for his sin. So man has to pay. But yet all men are now sinners since Adam and Eve fell. So man has nothing to offer to God. He can't pay for man's sin because he's a sinner. Everybody just deserves to die for their own sins. They can't pay for everybody else's sin. They already owe God themselves. They're already, even if a man could be perfectly conformed to God's will, that would just be good enough for him. I mean, he'd be doing his duty. It's not good enough to save anybody else. And yet, again, if man's not redeemed, then God made man and he had a purpose for him, but that purpose is frustrated because man can't fulfill the purpose. And so God wanted him to choose the supreme good, which is God himself, but man chose the wrong thing. And so, it's a dilemma. While none but man can make the satisfaction to compensate for man's sin, none but God can make that satisfaction, for the satisfaction has to be greater than anything in the universe except God. And so you see the great dilemma that God actually had, the great dilemma we have because of our sin. The satisfaction for God, therefore, has to be made by one who is both God and man. And that's why God became incarnate in Christ. You ought to read it sometime, Why God Became Man, by Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. You can find it online. You can read it, but it's very profound. And again, it's that forensic view of salvation, but I believe it's very legit. So Anselm is in the early stages of scholasticism, as it's just getting started. But then, as time goes on, there are many other scholastics. Another famous one was a man named Peter Abelard. And Abelard, I'll maybe talk about him a little further on, but Peter Abelard and a guy named Hugh of St. Victor. There was a monastery called St. Victor's Monastery south of Paris. And many greats came out of there. Peter Abelard, Hugh of St. Victor, Richard of St. Victor, a guy named Peter Lombard, and also another great scholastic figure, but he didn't come from St. Victor there, was Thomas Aquinas. And there were many other scholastics. The high tide of the scholastic movement was the latter part of the 12th and 13th century. It's important to recognize that scholasticism arose not only out of the medieval cathedral schools and universities, but also out of the influx during the years it existed of Greek philosophical thought. So it was really a product of that influx of Greek philosophical thought. There were these university schools, these cathedral schools and so forth. That's where the first universities developed. First there were monasteries and there were cathedral schools. But also during this time is when this Greek philosophical thought, the teachings of Plato and then the Neoplatonists and then Aristotle and Aristotelianism, these all began to come into Western Europe during those years. And believe me, they had a profound effect upon Christian as well as Jewish and Muslim thought during all those years. And, you can read about how the Jews were affected by this, Maimonides, and you can read how the Muslims were affected by this. The famous Muslim philosopher Ibn Sina, or he was called in the West Avicenna, from the years 980 to 1037, he lived in Uzbekistan and Iran. Avicenna is a real important figure, Muslim figure. But then also Ibn Rushd, or he's known in the West by the name Averroes. You might have read about that, Averroes. He was from 1126 to 1198. He lived in Andalusia, which is modern Spain. And so I mentioned before that Spain became a unique sort of melting pot of the three religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. They melded in a unique sort of way and basically got along and interacted with one another, and I think sharpened one another in a sense in Andalusia and in Spain during those years. By the way back in the 1st century AD, Philo was a Jewish philosopher who also melded philosophy with the revelation of Judaism. He tried to do it anyway. He believed Plato's philosophy was like a precursor to Christianity, and that he was a wise man sent from God, and that you could use Plato's philosophy and his way of looking at the world. You could kind of merge that or meld that with Judaism, and he tried to do that in some of his writings. So it's quite interesting, actually, the impact of Greek philosophy. Now, at the same time, many churchmen were very dubious of Greek philosophical influence. They were very dubious. Averroes, for example, he believed in dualism. In other words, the material world is evil, and it was created by a lesser God. That's the kind of thing that, Plato said, the demiurge created the physical world, and it's evil. And we need to get out of this prison of our bodies, and go into the higher realms and so forth. And so Averroes believed that sort of thing. He also denied personal immortality, which is a key Christian teaching. He denied that. He taught something else which is very problematic, and that was that you could believe something by faith even though it was proven false by reason. That's very dangerous. I do not in any way accept that. I don't think you should. I believe if something's true, it's true. It's not true in one realm and untrue in another. You can believe it by faith, but it's really not true. Listen, I can't have faith in something that's not true. I don't know about you. So that's a dangerous doctrine. And Of course, Averroes believed that the material world is eternal. That's what Aristotle believed. The material world was eternal. Well, the Bible says God created it at a certain point in time, right? And so these are anti-Christian beliefs. And yet, these philosophical beliefs were a tremendous influence. They were pouring in. Many were swayed by them. Many were wrestling with them. And certain Christians rejected them out of hand. They said, no, we shouldn't have anything to do with this. It's interesting that most of the Orthodox people rejected them because they were from the Greek world, and they knew that was pagan philosophy. But some Christians welcomed some of the things that Aristotle and Plato taught. They believed that they could be adapted to Christian use. Particularly among these were the Dominicans, the people of the Dominican order in the Roman Catholic Church. They believed that Christian faith could be thought through in Aristotelian terms. In other words, Aristotle kind of taught us how to think. And there is some truth to that. He's brilliant, and some of the things he teaches are good for us to know. Philosophical ways of thinking and so on. And so the Dominicans thought that you could use, this is great, we got Aristotle. We can take his ways of thinking and use them, apply them to Christian theology. Two of the most prominent Dominicans who were of this view were Albertus Magnus and his most famous student, Thomas Aquinas. Albertus Magnus was born in either 1193 or 1206, and he died in 1280. He lived in Germany, but he traveled quite a bit. He joined the Dominicans, who were called the Preachers, and he taught in various universities. He was very interested in a lot of different subjects, especially the natural sciences. So that's one of the reasons he liked Aristotle so much, because Aristotle had a lot to say about such things. And Albertus Magnus was also a theologian, of course, but he was acquainted with Neoplatonic thought as well as Aristotle's thought. And he systematically employed Aristotle in his approach to theology. He saw Aristotle as a pre-Christian Greek, and he saw him as a kind of an aid to Christian thought. That's how he saw Aristotle. He thought God sent Aristotle, God gave him his wisdom, and we can use that wisdom and apply it to Christian thought. And so Albertus Magnus, his most famous student was a man named Thomas Aquinas. And so Albertus Magnus heavily influenced Thomas Aquinas with this kind of belief. Now Aquinas lived from 1224 to 1274, and he's considered the very high point of scholasticism. He's known by the Catholic Church as the Doctor Angelicus, the angelic doctor. He joined the Dominicans at age 19, and they called him the dumb ox. It's so funny. Probably because he was kind of quiet, but he was also a little bit portly, fat, if I say it in the crude kind of way. He was heavy. And so they called him the dumb ox. But Albertus Magnus eventually said, yeah, you might call him a dumb ox, but you know what? Someday the whole world's going to hear this dumb ox as lowing. In other words, he recognized his genius, and he knew that his teaching was going to be spread all over the world. Now, Aquinas taught in Paris and in Spain, as well as several centers in Italy, and in the end he taught in Naples. He regarded himself as a scholar, a teacher, and a writer. He died when he was only 49. And he refuted Averroes because he said, look, Averroes wrongly interpreted Aristotle. See, he was loyal to Aristotle. He liked Aristotle. Averroes taught Aristotle. But Aquinas said, yeah, but Averroes got some things of Aristotelian thought wrong. And so it's interesting because Thomas Aquinas really knew Aristotle's writings, and he set out to incorporate Aristotelian thought into Christian theology. He really set out to do that. He purposed to do that. And he was opposed in that by the Franciscans. They were of a different mindset, and especially Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. They were followers of Augustine and of Plato, so they did not like Aristotle as much, and they opposed people who believed in adapting Christian theology to Aristotle, such as Aquinas. Here's a quote from La Tourette, his History of the Christian Church. He says, the great achievement of Thomas Aquinas was setting forth the relation of reason and faith in such fashion that those to whom the Aristotelian philosophy was definitive could feel that they might consistently remain Christians. In other words, see, Aristotle's teaching coming into the medieval world there was a blow to Christianity, and some people's faith was shaken. And so to us, it might not be a problem today, but just like to us, evolution's not a problem today. But when evolution, Charles Darwin's teachings first came out, man, they rocked the Christian world, and it took us a while to react to them and figure out how to respond to them and so forth. Same thing here with Aristotle. When those teachings came out, they rocked the Christian world, and many people were about to give up their faith because of Aristotle. But Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle and he melded it with Christianity, and it made it to where you could be an intellectual and know about Aristotle but still be a Christian. Two of the greatest works of Thomas Aquinas were the Summa contra Gentiles, or Gentiles, which is designed to equip missionaries to the Muslims with arguments in the presentation of their faith so that they could deal with Muslims. He equipped them by Summa contra Gentiles. And then his Summa Theologiae, or more commonly called Summa Theologica, is a massive work left uncompleted by his death, but that's one of his greatest, that is his greatest work. Now, he differed with both Augustine and Plato. He didn't believe in realism, which Plato believed in, the idea that there's these forms, like there's not just a dog here, but there's actually dogness. There's a form of dogness that exists. And he didn't agree with that. There's just individual dogs. Then he believed that man can know things by trusting his senses and his reason. He said that both reason and faith come from God, so they cannot be contradictory, and that's what I believe. Reason and faith both come from God. They're not contradictory. But he said our ultimate happiness is found in the contemplation of God. Now, Aquinas believed that free will was limited, but that man did have some degree of free will. Without the grace of God, however, man can't do any good whatsoever with his free will. And so Aquinas also believed in what later came to be called prevenient grace, which is kind of God's grace to us before we get saved. It kind of stirs us to want to repent. Aquinas held that the views of both Anselm and Abelard, that Christ made satisfaction for man's sins, he believed that. But he also believed, so Anselm believed that Christ, was a forensic view of salvation. Christ made satisfaction for our sin. But Abelard taught that Christ was more about being a moral example for us, that moved men to love him by his love for us. And so Aquinas believed that as well. He agreed with these two guys that were kind of contradictory, Anselm and Abelard. He believed both of their teachings. He's especially significant, Aquinas says, because certain heresies were in danger of overthrowing Christianity during his time. The Cathares, I mentioned them in an earlier talk, they're also called Albigensians. They propagated dualism, that there's an evil material world and then there's a higher spiritual world, and other views that were contrary to the New Testament. And the Avarists, they believed, in Aristotle's teachings, they contradicted some major Christian beliefs, and they were gaining in popularity. But by using Aristotle and showing that he could be seen as backing up rather than tearing down Christian faith, Aquinas strengthened Christian foundations. He gave reason an honorable place in Christian thought, showing that there was no conflict between faith and reason. It's interesting, I found in my office from the former pastor this, let me see if you can see this, this series on reason and faith, philosophy in the Middle Ages by a professor named Thomas Williams in Florida, University of South Florida. And I found this to be a very interesting series about all this, about the philosophers, the philosophy of the 1200s and so on, the Scholastic times. Very, very interesting if you ever get a chance. Reason and faith. It's just a tremendously important subject to think about. And so I agree with Aquinas that reason can back up our Christian faith rather than tearing it down. I believe reason can strengthen Christian foundations. And the Christian faith is completely reasonable. Now, it's also interesting that this Thomas Williams mentions that in 1277, a bishop of Paris by the name of Stephen Tempier published a list of 219 philosophical and theological theses that were to be condemned. He said in this document, which came to be called the Condemnation of 1277, that anyone who believed in these 219 theses or taught them was to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And so that was a strong reaction against those who were so favorable to these non-Christian philosophers. So there was a time when they were, welcomed and brought into Christian theology, but then there were also reactions to them. So here's another quote I want to read for you from Alistair McGrath in his book on the Reformation. He says, quote, "Scholasticism is probably one of the most despised intellectual movements in human history. Thus, the English word dunce, which we take to mean fool, derives from the name of one of the greatest scholastic writers, John Duns Scotus. Scholastic thinkers, the schoolmen, as they were called, are often represented as debating earnestly, if pointlessly, how many angels could dance on the head of a pin," unquote. And so, some people hate the scholastics and speak against them. But that being said, McGrath goes on to say that scholasticism was of fundamental importance to the Reformation. And I really have come to see that as well. And so we'll talk about that later and show you how it fits. We'll also discuss humanism a little later. But it's important to know that the humanism, there was a movement of humanism that really began in the Renaissance at kind of the end of this period. And it's not the humanism that we know about called secular humanism, which is totally anti-religious. The humanism of this time was highly religious, and they were some of the people who were very negative about scholasticism, and they hated it and so forth, and they just thought they were nitpickers who argued about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. The humanists actually invented the term the Middle Ages, because they looked back to the classical period of ancient Greece and Rome, and that was the golden age. And then the modern times started with the Renaissance, the 1400s. And so the time between them, those periods, they called it the Middle Ages, and they called the early part of that the Dark Ages, which turns out to be a misnomer, completely false. But anyway, that's where those terms came about, because of the humanists. The truth is, though, that after the Renaissance, there was a period of fervent intellectual growth, and Paris became sort of the intellectual center of Europe. And it was there that two themes began to dominate theological debate: the need to systematize and expand Christian theology, and the need to demonstrate the inherent rationality of that theology. So for years, the church had mostly just followed the theology of Augustine, but now they wanted to go further and kind of systematize that knowledge that they had. The question was, how was that to be done? By what method, and on the basis of what philosophical system? And see, what happened was the answer came through, as they were searching how to systematize theology and so forth. The answer came through the rediscovery of Aristotle in the late 12th and the early 13th century. And so through Aquinas and Duns Scotus, Aristotle's ideas became established as the best means of establishing and developing Christian theology. So, as McGrath puts it, this then is the essence of scholasticism, the demonstration of the inherent rationality of Christian theology by an appeal to philosophy. Interesting. It's just very interesting. So scholasticism arose in the universities, and that's where it had its influence, but humanism began to gain in popularity, and the humanists and the scholastics began to clash with one another. The University of Vienna experienced this clash in a big way, and it was to play an important role in the Swiss Reformation. But Martin Luther's theological development took place in reaction to scholastic theology, because although it was losing strength in Switzerland, it was still of major importance in Germany, where Luther was. And so, as we'll see, there were really several reformations, not just one. There was the Lutheran Reformation, which started off in a university context to reform theology, but there was a Swiss or Reformed Church Reformation, which took place where humanists held sway and was more of an effort to kind of reform society and morals, not just theology. So we'll look at that more next time. We'll talk more about humanism, and we'll talk about the different reformations as we're leading up to this teaching about the Reformation. Hope you'll join me at that time.